What if bringing a greeting card to a political knife fight was actually, the most ruthless, effective strategy a world leader could use?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd at first glance. We are entirely conditioned to treat government like this uh, intricate, unfeeling machine.
Right. Like when we discuss geopolitics, we use the vocabulary of engineering and warfare. We talk about leverage, tactical coalitions, capital.
Exactly, raw power. We just assume the only way to turn the gears of a society is by applying calculated force.
But today's deep dive is going to take that conventional vocabulary and just, well, throw it completely out the window.
Yeah, we're looking at a really fascinating premise today.
We are. It's this argument that the concept of love, a word we usually safely quarantine in poetry books or our personal lives, might actually be the most pragmatic, hard-nosed tool we possess for running a functioning government.
And the source material we're unpacking makes a profound case for this.
Yeah.
We're looking at a 2019 op-ed from Counterpunch titled In the Name of Love by Dr. J.P. Linstroth. And we're also pulling from notes highlighting his 2022 book, Politics and Racism Beyond Nations, a multidisciplinary approach to crises.
And what's key here is that Dr. Linstroth isn't just making some superficial plea for people to be nicer to one another.
No, not at all. Our mission today is to explore how he pulls from the absolute depths of Buddhist and Christian philosophy to fundamentally rewire the mechanics of leadership.
It is a perspective that completely changes how you watch the evening news. I mean, Linstroth wrote this op-ed in February, specifically noting African American History Month. And he actually borrows the title from that U2 song about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Pride in the name of love.
Yeah, exactly. And he anchors the entire piece with King's famous assertion, darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that.
Setting that historical baseline is crucial because Linstroth immediately challenges us to look at how that philosophy operates in modern high-stakes environments.
Like where the rubber meets the road.
Right. And he points directly to Jacinda Ardern. In 2017, at just 37-year-old, she became the Prime Minister of New Zealand.
And importantly, she became a new mother while in office.
Yes. Linstroth argues that this specific experience of motherhood actively informed her rejection of traditional realpolitik. She looked at those Machiavellian power games that define global politics and consciously chose a completely different mechanism for governing.
There's a quote she gave right before being sworn in that captures this shift perfectly. She said, I want people to feel that it's open, that it's listening, and that it's going to bring kindness back. And she goes on to say that if people see an empathetic government, they'll understand that when they make hard calls, they're doing it with the right focus in mind.
Notice the architecture of her argument there. She is anticipating the exact skepticism people have about kindness in politics.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the immediate pushback, and I felt this myself reading it, is that bringing kindness to global politics sounds, well, a bit naive.
Like bringing a greeting card to a boardroom knife fight.
Exactly. Empathy sounds like a luxury you literally cannot afford when dealing with national security or trade deficits or global pandemics. It just sounds soft.
What's fascinating here is that Ardern is arguing the exact opposite. She isn't saying an empathetic government avoids making hard calls. She's stating that empathy is the underlying foundation that allows a government to survive making them.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Think about the mechanics of Machiavellian power. If you make a difficult policy decision using fear or coercion, you generate immediate resentment, right?
Yeah, naturally.
That resentment acts as friction in the system, which requires you to spend way more political capital just to maintain control.
So it's inherently unstable. You're constantly fighting the backlash of your own decisions.
Precisely. In Ardern's model, empathy is a strategic choice. If the public fundamentally trusts that your baseline is kindness and your ultimate goal is their well-being, they will absorb the shock of a hard call.
They won't riot over a difficult budget because they trust the intent.
Right. Empathy becomes the shock absorber that prevents the system from fracturing under pressure.
It's a brilliant reframing. Empathy isn't the opposite of a hard call. It's the prerequisite for making one. But that leads to a fairly massive logistical problem.
How so?
Well, humans aren't naturally wired to be universally empathetic, especially not to political rivals. If this is a necessary muscle for governance, what philosophical gym does Linstroth send us to so we can actually train it?
That's the perfect way to phrase it. And he sends us first to the Buddhist tradition. In his 2022 book, Linstroth dedicates an entire chapter to understanding love through this specific lens.
And in the op-ed, he focuses heavily on the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, right?
Yes, a global spiritual leader and peace activist whom Linstroth actually refers to as a living saint. Linstroth zeroes in on a concept Thich Nhat Hanh championed called interbeing.
The word itself is striking. Interbeing. It's the concept that everyone and everything in the known universe is structurally interconnected.
Yeah, Linstroth includes this beautiful quote from Thich Nhat Hanh's book, Living Buddha, Living Christ. He says, "When we look into the heart of a flower, we see clouds, sunshine, minerals, time, the earth, and everything else in the cosmos in it."
I mean, it sounds highly poetic, but Linstroth is using it to describe literal material reality, isn't he?
He is. He connects this Buddhist concept of interbeing directly to the biological Gaia hypothesis.
The idea that the Earth isn't just a dead rock with life living on top of it.
Exactly. The Gaia hypothesis proposes that the Earth is a complex, self-regulating system. Organic and inorganic matter are so deeply intertwined that they function almost as a single organism. The bacteria in the soil, the atmosphere, they are constantly sustaining one another.
And Linstroth makes the point that indigenous peoples around the world have historically understood this interconnected worldview, like just as a matter of basic survival, whereas the West has spent millennia aggressively trying to forget it.
And he blames that forgetting on what he calls Cartesian separation.
Okay, what exactly is that?
It's the philosophical legacy of René Descartes. Descartes gave us the famous axiom, "I think, therefore I am." But the unintended consequence of that idea was that it trapped Western thought inside the individual mind.
Oh, I see.
It created the illusion that the mind is entirely separate from the body, that humanity is separate from nature, and, most dangerously, that you are fundamentally separate from everyone else.
So Cartesian separation is the birth of the ultimate isolated ego.
Yes.
And if you genuinely believe you are just a standalone unit operating in a vacuum, then Machiavellian zero-sum politics makes total logical sense. You have to maximize your own power at the expense of others because you literally don't view them as part of yourself.
And this is exactly why Linstroth pairs the concept of interbeing with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, or a smriti in Sanskrit.
Which Linstroth defines as a hyper-awareness in the moment. To put this in perspective for you listening, think about your morning cup of coffee.
That's a great example.
If you are operating under Cartesian separation, that coffee is just an isolated product you bought. But if you apply the hyper-awareness of inner being, you suddenly realize you can't physically separate that liquid from the rain in Colombia, the global shipping industry, or the farmers. When you take a sip, you are literally drinking the globe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that realization fundamentally changes the utility of mindfulness. In the West, we've largely commodified mindfulness into like a personal relaxation technique, a way to lower your heart rate before a stressful meeting.
Right. Personal zen.
But Linstroth argues that true mindfulness is an absolute prerequisite for solving complex social problems. It leads to deep listening. When you truly listen and understand the structural reality of our connection, you naturally develop a desire to relieve the suffering of others.
Because you recognize that their suffering is actually a dysfunction in the system you rely on?
Precisely.
I can see how that works flawlessly when we talk about abstract global systems or the environment. It's relatively easy to feel interbeing with a farmer in Colombia or a cloud in the sky. And this is the ultimate friction point. What happens when that interconnected web includes someone you absolutely despise?
Yeah, that's the real test.
How do you practice interbeing with a political opponent who is actively causing harm?
That is where the philosophical heavy lifting truly begins. Buddhism outlines the structural, systemic reality of our connection. But to address the gritty, painful friction of interpersonal conflict, Linstroth transitions to the Christian perspective.
He pulls heavily from C.S. Lewis here. And Linstroth treats Lewis not just as the author of Narnia, but as a heavyweight intellectual who deeply struggled with the ugly realities of his faith.
He really was.
Linstroth puts Lewis alongside figures like Miguel de Unamuno, who wrote St. Emmanuel the Good Martyr, and Nikos Kazantzakis, the author of The Last Temptation of Christ. These were brilliant minds agonizing over how faith actually functions in a deeply broken world.
And in the Christian tradition, the most demanding instruction regarding a broken world is the golden rule found in Matthew 22.39, loving your neighbor as yourself, coupled with the even more radical command in Matthew 5.39 to love your enemy and turn the other cheek.
Linstroth uses a phenomenal quote from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity to explain the mechanism behind this. Lewis argues that God intends us to love all selves in the exact same way that God loves us. We aren't loved for our attractive qualities or our good deeds. We are loved simply because we possess a self.
It strips away the entire concept of meritocracy from human value. You are commanded to love the fundamental self beneath the person's actions, even if those actions are abhorrent.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is, but Lewis doesn't stop there. He diagnoses exactly why we find this so difficult, and it has to do with the physical pleasure of anger.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this was the moment in the op-ed that hit me the hardest. Lewis drops this absolute bombshell of a sentence. He says we actually find hatred such a pleasure that to give it up is like giving up beer or tobacco.
Identifying hatred as an addiction decades before the invention of the internet is a staggering psychological insight.
Wait, hatred as an addiction? Like nicotine? Think about your own scrolling habits for a second. When you see a post from a politician or a group you despise, pay attention to what happens in your body.
There's a physiological rush.
Yeah, a dopamine hit of self-righteousness.
Oh.
Outrage gives us absolute clarity. It gives us an easy villain and makes us the hero of our own narrative. Lewis is pointing out that we don't hold on to hatred just because we think we are morally right. We hold on to it because it feels incredibly good.
By framing hatred as a vice, a pleasurable habit we indulge in, Lewis completely deflates the ego of our outrage. You might think you're a righteous crusader defending the truth, but Lewis is suggesting you're often just enjoying the psychological equivalent of a cigarette.
Which means that overcoming political or personal hatred isn't about the other person finally admitting they are wrong. It's an act of internal discipline.
Exactly. It demands that we manage our own addiction to outrage, overlook the personal shortcomings that trigger us, and force ourselves to see the inherent good in the underlying self of our enemies.
Now, combine those two massive philosophical frameworks. You have Thich Nhat Hanh's structural reality of interconnected interbeing and C.S. Lewis's radical disciplined forgiveness of the self.
Right.
The crucial question of Linstroth's thesis is, what happens when you take those high-minded concepts and try to draft them into national law? How does an understanding of interbeing functionally rewrite a domestic policy?
Linstroth argues that it requires a total paradigm shift towards societal well-being. He specifically points to the policies surrounding our most vulnerable populations.
Like those suffering from mental health issues, the homeless, the impoverished.
Yes, the undereducated and the uninsured. Now, it's really important to state clearly here that Dr. Linstroth is arguing for these specific social policies as the logical outcome of his thesis.
Right, and just to be clear for you listening, we aren't endorsing or condemning these specific policies on this deep dive.
Exactly. We are simply examining them as Linstroth's proposed application of empathetic politics. He argues that if a society genuinely accepts the biological and spiritual reality of interbeing, leaving the vulnerable to suffer becomes philosophically impossible.
Because under partition separation, poverty or homelessness is framed as an individual failure, just a nuisance for the rest of society to manage or ignore.
But under interbeing, an unhoused population or an uninsured community is an infection in the collective body. If the foot is infected, the whole body suffers.
To treat those issues as isolated problems is to operate under a delusion.
This is why Linstroth used empathetic domestic policy not as charity but as structural maintenance. And to illustrate this practical application, he brings us back to Jacinda Ardern, but this time at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland.
Oh, wow. You cannot find a louder echo chamber for Cartesian separation and traditional power metrics than Davos.
Yet Ardern stood on that stage and directly challenged those metrics. She said, "I don't think it's the end of GDP. I think it's the beginning of doing things differently. Our people are telling us that politics are not delivering and meeting their expectations."
And she finishes by saying, this is not woolly, it's critical, right?
Yes.
So what does this all mean? Let's unpack that word woolly. She means fuzzy, soft, sentimental. She is standing in front of the world's financial elite, arguing that empathy is hard data. Well-being is a tangible, necessary metric for a functioning economy.
Because gross domestic product, the total financial output of a country, only measures the speed of the machine. It tells you nothing about the health of the people operating it.
It is exactly like trying to measure the success of a family purely by looking at their bank account. Yes, the bank account is important for survival, but if you measure success solely by that number, while totally ignoring their physical health or whether they even speak to each other at dinner, you have a failing family.
Even if they are incredibly wealthy, the structure is collapsing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Ardern's point, and Linstroth's overarching argument, is that global politics is currently that wealthy, collapsing family. The citizenry is deeply unhappy because the metrics we use to measure success are divorced from the reality of our inner being.
This raises an important question. If politics is failing to meet expectations globally, perhaps the missing metric isn't financial efficiency. It is the actual implementation of this mindful, disciplined love.
Linstroth concludes his op-ed by returning to the Martin Luther King Jr. quote we started with. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. It acts as the final synthesis. It marries the pragmatic reality of cause and effect with the deepest spiritual truths.
Hate is a mechanism that inherently creates more of itself. It is a self-replicating friction. Love, defined here as hyper-aware empathy and disciplined forgiveness, is the only mechanism capable of absorbing that friction and creating stability.
Which brings us to the most vital application of this deep dive. Why does this matter for you? You might not be a head of state drafting international trade agreements, but you are a citizen operating within a complex web of relationships.
Whether you are managing a team at work, navigating a contentious boardroom, or just sitting on your couch watching the evening news and feeling your blood pressure rise, you have a fundamental choice in how you operate.
You can default to the illusion of Cartesian separation. You can view everyone around you as a competing, isolated unit and indulge in the addictive pleasure of outrage every time someone wrongs you. Or you can choose the harder, vastly more effective path.
You can practice the deeply uncomfortable discipline of inner being. You can choose to wield empathy not as a passive weakness, but as the foundational strength required to make the hard, necessary calls in your own life.
That is so well said.
And as we wrap up, there's one final provocative thought that emerges from Linstroth's framework for you to mull over. Consider the paradox of our modern era. We live in a hyper-connected digital age.
We really do.
We have literally built an infrastructure of global interbeing. Our data, our communications, our supply chains are entirely woven together. Yet study after study shows we feel more isolated, more angry, and more separated than at any point in modern history.
Why is that?
Could it be that our technology has perfectly connected our data, but in the process we completely forgot to connect our empathy? We built the mechanical hardware of inner being, but we are still trying to run it using the outdated software of Cartesian separation. We built the machine, but we forgot to fuel it with love.
That is a staggering realization to walk away with. We have the interconnected world Thich Nhat Hanh described, but we are managing it with the addictive hatred C.S. Lewis warned us about. Thank you for joining us on this intellectual journey today. Next time you hear a politician talking about strategy or you feel that familiar rush of righteous outrage scrolling through your feed, take a breath. Look for the clouds in your coffee, recognize your own inner being, and ask yourself if there's a more pragmatic, powerful tool available. We will catch you on the next deep dive.